Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Diversity and Inclusion in Open Source, but also Open Communities and Open Everywhere call. It is September the 4th in 2018. We have Jess Mitchell here speaking today. I'm so excited. And also later in the call, Alicia will be joining us. And I hear an echo because I have your Mozilla open. There's a delay. So if you haven't already, please go to the wiki page and open the HackMD agenda where you'll find a roll call. So we're really interested in who's turning up for this call and where you're from and how you envision your participation in this broader community. There we go. I see Gina signing in. Welcome, Gina. I'll also say that this call is the first one that we've done where you can't see everyone who's on the call from a video perspective. This is like an experiment using the new Mozilla, so I'll probably ask you for some feedback after the call. Underneath the roll call on the HackMD pad is the collaboration zone. This is the place where you can let people know what help you need. So one thing that we know for sure is that a lot of us are working on the same problems, running into the same walls, and that there are others that we can be collaborating with. So if you need help with something, even if it's just thought partnership, please add the help you need. And if you're also interested in lending help and you have the time, disclaimer, make sure you have actual time to be enthusiastic around this work. You add your name under there. So we have a pretty full agenda, and I'm just going to get started here, introducing you, Jess Mitchell, and I will hand it over. Jess, if you want to introduce yourself a bit better than I can.
Yeah, no, thanks, Emma. First of all, apologies to you because I have way too many slides for the time I have allotted, and I'm going to skip an introduction about myself because it's not that interesting. But I'm a senior manager at the Inclusive Design Research Center at OCAD University, and I want to talk to you about some stuff today that I hope is going to ruin your vision and maybe challenge the way that you're doing things now or thinking about things now. And I want to just jump right in, and then if anybody wants to find out more about my background or what I'm up to or what I do, please be in touch with me. I've got my Twitter handle there. You can also email me. It's just jmitchell@ocadu.ca. Okay, I want to challenge you to think differently about everything. A lot of people come to us looking for direction at the Inclusive Design Research Center, and they want to know how to do things more inclusively, more accessibly. They don't quite know what that means. They know they want to do things differently. They want to improve things. They want to, they see others doing things that they admire, and they want to figure out how to do some of that in their own organization. And what I contend is that to improve ever more, you don't need a process, you need a change in mindset. So what I want to talk about is what we aren't seeing, what we can do, and how we can do it. I want to jump right in. This is just an example of unintended consequences. Time magazine called this Everyday Sexism in 2015. So this is just a scene that is going to be common or familiar to many of you, which is a men's and a women's room right next to each other, labeled men and ladies in this case. And the difference you see between the two of them is obviously there's a line at the women's room and there's not a line at the men's room. We often run into this at conferences that we go to. If you go to a tech conference, it's changing now, but 5 years ago, there was a lineup at the men's room, and that was the one time that you could get into the women's room very quickly and easily. If you go to a conference about design, it's often the opposite. So what about restrooms need to be specific to gender? And restrooms have become a big issue lately as well with gender neutral restrooms. But why can't we abstract this to address the needs of who happens to be at the conference or who happens to be overrepresented at whatever place that we are? And this is what I think is the new sort of form of exclusion. These are these new subtle, I guess they're not that new, they're subtle, they're more nuanced ways of expressing everyday ableism and everyday racism, as well as everyday sexism. And I think that it's these subtle little things that, so who architected this is one of the questions. Who decided that men's rooms and women's rooms needed to be the same size? And who decided that we needed to decide what gender we were before we walked into a restroom? Why isn't it about the equipment that's available in the room? Why can't I choose what equipment to use? We see this in the digital realm as well. This is just an image of the WebAIM homepage. It's webaim.org. It's a great resource. This is what a visual user will see. And this next screen is what a user who relies on a screen reader will see. And it's these subtle ways that we say, you're welcome here. This is where you're meant to be. There's a little skip to main content at the top. And if for a screen reader user or user who's relying on a screen reader to navigate a page, that can be actually quite a time saver and quite helpful, because each time you want to navigate through to a link in the content, if you've got an extensive navigation list at the top and even the drop downs within each of those at the top, you'd have to navigate through all of that to get to the content. This little skip to content lets you bypass all of that. So again, it's a little way that we express you're welcome here, you're meant to be here, this content is for you as well. We see these unintended consequences in the world and on Twitter, and good jokes are made of them, like the Bic for Her pens that came out. What's strange about this is who made these decisions? Who sat in a boardroom and said at Bic, yes, what we need to do is market pens to women in these brightly colored formats, and we need to call them, Bic for Her. So there are plenty of women who are feminine, and there are plenty of women who are masculine. And it begs the question, who uses these pens? So I start to think, does Angela Merkel, does Christine Lagarde, the director of the IMF, would my mom use these pens? Would I use these pens? And the answer is resoundingly no. And those are all women. So I use pens that come in exactly these colors, but are gel pens marketed to designers. They look and feel like a design tool. I can choose the 0.5 millimeter, which is very important to me. I have strong feelings about that versus 0.7. And they're the same pens that my male colleagues use. So what about these pens needs to be marketed to women? And again, who's making those decisions? And we see a change in this. So we see the typical, what is your gender, to the less typical, or the change in the more current, what is your gender, and even many more options than this, but the notion of an other. And you can see great examples of how this has an impact on technology. If you look at when the Defense of Marriage Act was struck down in the US, there was this great blog post, I can make the link available, that a developer put together for anyone who had coded their database to include spouses meant to be opposite sex. And all of a sudden, here you see how we can code some of these assumptions we're making about spouses into our databases, and it has an impact. So what does it mean to abstract that, and instead of choosing a binary, choose an other, or choose many more options? The point is that nothing is neutral. Some people say they aren't political, they aren't an activist. All those things can be true, but what is also true is when they're making decisions in their everyday, those decisions are ones that will either include or exclude others. We all make choices, and I'd like to call them design choices all the time. How is our living room arranged? The seating settings in our car. So for instance, manufacturers give us an option for 2 presets in our cars, right? The idea, I think, is that a mom and a dad would drive the car, and dad would be very tall and need lots of extra leg room, and mom would be much smaller and need to be closer to the wheel. But what about a family that doesn't look like that? What about a child in a family that does look like that then gets a driver's license? Now you've got a third driver. And so you get into these funny situations where we're making assumptions about families, we're making assumptions about the way people organize their families and the way that they choose to organize their lives around their families. Not only is nothing neutral, but the way things begin matters. And this is just a picture of a slide from somebody else's talk. The references are there, but It says apartheid was legal, the Holocaust was legal, slavery was legal, colonialism was legal. Legality is a matter of power, not justice. And the point here is how you ask the question matters, and the way things begin matters. So what do women want? So who are the women that we're talking about? What do seniors want? Which seniors? What do people with disabilities want? How are you defining disability? Who's a South African? Who is an ideal human? Who has the power and who can do the labor? Who is civilized? The way you ask the question has an impact on the way that you proceed with policies, with politics, with power, and with design. So are you setting yourself up for failure from the beginning because of the way you're asking the question that is embedded with assumptions, with biases? And I found it liberating to do the opposite of what comes natural or first to mind or easily. So ask, how can I make this experience suck for people, instead of asking, how can I make this really appealing for straight white men who are in the age range of 26 to 36? And then ask, instead of how do I do that, how do I make it suck for people? And then ask, am I doing any of those things that would make it less than ideal for people? So the contention is that when design fails, it's often because the designer starts from their own assumptions, from their own biases, their own behaviors, their own plans, and their own expectations. And we all do this. We have an expectation. We're not so scientific. We walk in with already ideas about how to solve things or what the outcome is going to look like. So this is just a picture of a push me pull you, which I'm quite fond of. It's an animal that isn't real, and it's neither here nor there. It's both its front and its back, and it's going in neither direction. So what if we become aware of all of our biases? We'll solve all of these problems I'm talking about, right? Not really. So it's a good place to start, but it isn't in and of itself going to solve the problem. What it would look like is we'd be curious instead of making assumptions. We'd wonder instead of knowing. We'd ask more than we assume. For many of us, that would be pretty unsettling. It would sort of shift us into this personal questioning. It would leave us with uncertainty. If you wonder about everything, we often say that you sort of walk with your head in the clouds. And this isn't something that's culturally valued. Our society and our culture values decisiveness, clarity, simplicity. So what does it mean to abandon this curiosity and this knowing? So biases do something for us. They make the world simpler. They make us doubt ourselves less. They make us feel certain and complete and comfy. And I think that we shouldn't want to feel those things. I think we should push ourselves and we should challenge ourselves. So the question is, well, why aren't we? And I think that this is all of us. This is everyone. We are lazy. We take the quick fix. We feel uncomfortable or anxious. We take a pill for it. We have a conflict. We avoid the conflict. We don't know something. We don't admit it, or we defer to somebody else entirely. We're taught these ways of approaching problems. And when I present you with a problem, what's the first thing you do? Many of us often solve it, and we try to solve it as quickly and efficiently as we can. We try to be the first to solve it, the first to get to the solution. So what I want to talk about is some of these assumptions in the ways that we're doing things. And I'm hoping you're feeling a little uneasy, a little unsettled, a little queasy, maybe. I can't see you, which is kind of strange, but we'll just keep going. If you're feeling uneasy, that's a good place to be, I argue. So I just want to talk about the way that we do things now. We often start with a brief that explains our vision. We define the outcomes. We find a method to apply to achieve those results, and then we find a method to measure the success of those results. And I think that this feels a little bit to me like the form of education where you're just studying to the exam. It's not genuine learning. It's not genuine curiosity. We're not genuinely asking anything scientific and then measuring it. So when we're trying to do these things now, what we do is we restate the vision and purpose. We show the outcomes have occurred at the end of the project. We show we've used the method that we said we would use, and we show the measures of success. How is it then that things ever fail? How can projects ever fail? How can we ever fail to achieve the results we hoped for? We often do, and then we write a variance and we explain why we failed. But why are we not catching these failures? If this is such a great path to success, it seems ironclad. Why does it fail? And I would argue this because this is how things really are. They're unpredictable, they're dynamic, they're emerging and they're adapting. Our world is so complex at this point, it is unreasonable to think that we can predict, that we can isolate, that we can know, that we can expect exactly. So what I want to talk about are how we do these three things now: thinking, doing, and feeling. And these are often three that are the starting place for what people are calling design or design thinking and inclusive design thinking. So just charging ahead, because again, I have too many slides, but want to get through all this. The how we think. We often simplify, we oversimplify complexity to make sense of the world. And we do this for good reasons, because the world is chaotic, because it's overwhelming, because there are a lot of things in it. And we also carve out a space in the world for ourselves. We often go to, take transit, go to work, go to the grocery store, go to the gym, go back home, go to work, go to the grocery store, go to the gym, come back home. The number of places that we actually, unique places that we actually wind up going in a week is really quite small. And we often simplify to sameness. It's called confirmation bias. It's one of the biases that's sort of one of, I think, human favorites. So one way we simplify things is to see it through our own lens. The things that are the way that I am, people who do things the way I do them, it often leads us to the way things are because they work for us, or it leads us to putting lipstick on a pig. That is, we see the way we've done things and the way our mother did things and the way our grandmother did things, and then we slightly innovate, but we miss an opportunity at looking at something more complex. I'll give you a tangible example. Here's a trampoline, and many of us grew up with trampolines, and you see how it's about 2 or 3 feet off the ground. It's just far enough for many of us to fall and break a clavicle, break an arm, break a leg, break a shoulder. So the solution here, and this is me oversimplifying to be transparent, the solution here that people came up with was to build netting around it. So you see these two kids in the trampoline in this kind of netted environment. Sort of, how do you contain these jumping monkeys? Well, you put a net around them. What I think that this falls into is this misconception that if we explore something end to end, that we're going to know it and predict it, that we're going to be able to control it, we can fix it, and we can design for that fix. We can motivate it, we can do all of these things. So the answer to an algorithm that gets something wrong is, my algorithm didn't get enough data. It can be improved. If I didn't predict or control it, it's I didn't get enough time to train it or control it or predict it. And we get into this kind of recursive control and prediction of a world that I argue is beyond control and prediction. I'm not slipping into relativism, but I argue that a control and prediction were things that we were capable of doing. The Harvey Weinstein Company would have had some warnings in their annual report last year. Instead, what I'm saying, what would happen if we embraced complexity? If instead of oversimplifying, we said, you know what, it is really complex, and let's take a look at how we can look at edge cases or counter examples. And in this regard, what I'm saying is that the aim would be for resiliency and flexibility. Instead of a one size fits all, it would be a one size fits one. So there's a little plant that's growing up out of impossible concrete. And it's really the capacity to recover from difficulties or a toughness that I think is this kind of design. It also, I think, is fundamentally more inclusive. So take a look at a trampoline that's built into the ground in this case. And this is a playground at a children's rehabilitation hospital where they have an integrated kindergarten program where kids with disabilities learn alongside kids without disabilities and vice versa. And what you have here is kids without physical disabilities jumping on a trampoline with kids who are, in this case, this young boy is in a wheelchair. So the experience of jumping is just a common experience that they all have. And this doesn't require the netting. This doesn't require the 2 to 3 feet for everybody to sort of get hurt, though I do see an edge where you can still crack your head. Anyway, the point is that now you've created an environment where all the kids can play together. So that was just the how are we thinking. Now I want to go into how we're feeling. We aren't all that tuned into emotional responses. We have them, and they influence what we do and what we decide to do. we're not always all that tuned into them. And then when we start to think about other people's emotional responses, we do a lot of speculating. It's fun, but we often get it wrong. So when things are not neat, noble, and simple, we want to be able to predict them, right? So when we run into incomplete and messy, it's unsettling. Those are hard feelings that should be avoided. The best we can ever do, we tell ourselves, is to focus on the most or the average. And what this does is this lets us off the hook. This is that oversimplification in action. If the best we can do is to help the most or the average, then we're absolving ourselves of many, many people. So we're taking a look at something like the 80-20 rule, right? So instead of focusing on everyone, we're going to say 80-20 because everyone is just overwhelming. And this is just an image of a scatter plot. So you've got a couple of dots in this that are outliers, right? We don't try to understand what that is. We norm for that, or we say that's statistically insignificant because there's only one that's out there in the outliers section. But what would happen if instead of ignoring the outliers, we focused on them instead? So what would happen if we solve for the edges instead of solving for the average? And there's this wonderful book by Todd Rose called The End of Average. And what I love about the book is it goes into historically how we came to rely on something like the average, because none of us is average. So what this does is it gets us away from this notion of the average and instead has us focusing on the edges where there's failure and where there are gaps. I'm not a negative person, but I think that this is what design should be doing, is focusing on the failures. So what it does for us is it reveals opportunities in spaces where there are opportunities. We can understand or ask, why is it failing for this person? Is that intentional? Is that desirable? It shows places for innovation. So in the case of the trampoline, there's an opportunity for kids to be involved in an activity they weren't previously involved with in previous designs. It addresses those unmet needs and it reaches untapped markets. So what I would say is aim for curiosity, not solving. So asking why, and this is just a picture of a little guy with his arms up in a Y configuration. And one of the things that we have put together at the Inclusive Design Research Center is the Inclusive Design Guide. And it includes some tools and techniques and activities. One is called the grandparent-grandchild game. And that is just this notion of asking why over and over and over again, like little kids have a tendency to do, because it gets at fundamental reasons. If because is the answer, that might not be good enough for the little guy or for the design decisions. So that's how we're feeling. Now I'm going to go into a little bit about how we do. We look awfully busy and all of our meetings are amazing, but we're still not doing as much as we know we can or as much as we want to do. So in design thinking and those activities, you see a lot of post-it walls. And post-it walls are great, but they aren't in and of themselves enough. They're a great way to get people thinking together. But it isn't the case that everything is amazing. And this t-shirt says everything is amazing and nobody's happy. So I'm going to sort of unpack that a little. How do we do things now? So when we're presented with a problem, the first thing many of us do, as I said, is we solve it as quickly and as efficiently as we can. We don't pause to think about necessarily understanding the problem in depth. And what I mean by that is understanding the edge cases. For whom will it fail? Understanding the counterexamples. In which scenario will this not work? And addressing some of those complexities. So what I want to ask is, what would happen if we didn't try to complete our designs, but rather tried to continually improve them? And this is going to be a familiar concept because we can smell aspects of agile design or development here, iterative design. There are a lot of methodologies that try to incorporate some of this continual improvement. I want to give an example. What we see is not always the whole story. So this is a picture of an iceberg of of understanding users and user feelings. The behavior is on the top of the water and all the feelings and needs are underneath. And then this iceberg sort of broken down further. This is the anger iceberg. So at the top you see angry. And that's the manifestation. That's how somebody appears. Underneath, you see no fewer than 20 descriptions: embarrassed, tricked, frustrated, rejected, trapped, annoyed, exhausted, lonely, disappointed, uncomfortable, regret, worried, hurt, insecure. Those all can manifest as angry. So one of the things that we do with that is, I'll give you an example. We were doing some user testing on a keypad, accessible keypad that we made for the Community Museum for Human Rights. And we had a user come in and he had a very strong reaction to the keypad. He was angry. And so one of our designers said, well, can you explain to me, what you're feeling? Since I'm angry, I don't like this. And he said, well, why are you angry? Can you help us understand that? And he said, well, it doesn't have any text on the buttons. And at that point, the designer could have made a note text on the buttons, and then it could have gone into a Jira or some bug tracking system, and then a developer puts text on the buttons. But she was curious, and she said, well, what does text on the buttons mean to you? And to him, it meant, I'm just going to kill my video here. I'm seeing that I'm having some bandwidth issues. To him, it meant that it had been dumbed down. He had often seen things for people with disabilities that had been dumbed down because the assumption was they wouldn't be able to understand it. And in fact, he'd had a doctor early in his life tell him not even to bother to learn the alphabet or how to read or how to write because he wouldn't be able to do it functionally. So it was much more than just the anger of text on the buttons. We didn't put text on the buttons in the end, but every time we think about putting text on buttons and whether or not we're going to do that, you bet we think about him and about the reaction that we had. So I talk about how we do things a little bit more. I'm going to talk about who are we designing for. So we're implicitly designing for just some when we ignore the needs of all. And we often talk in shorthand. We say we're designing for men, or we're designing for women. We're designing for baby boys, baby girls, or new moms. But these aren't people. I want to warn us again that cataloging of things, whether it's people or stuff, is not a neutral act. That when we say men, we're talking about these taxonomies, and what we call this is the tyranny of taxonomies, that you start to sort people into buckets. They don't neatly fit into buckets. And so you either wind up creating new buckets, or you wind up constraining people to fit into the buckets because it fits your taxonomy better. So instead of doing this, what would happen if we focused on the less typical instead? What if we valued that? And I think that we sometimes focus, we see this sometimes, a focus on the atypical or the unpopular. So many of our systems focus on the usual, but what, for instance, would it look like if we said we want to focus on men of small stature on a subway train, or women who are digital geniuses, or even senior citizen women who are digital geniuses, or young boys who like to play with dolls, or young girls who like science, or new moms who don't feel connected to their babies? It might change our image of masculinity, right? It might change our image of women in technology. We might start to market toys differently. It might make changes to STEAM education. We might establish supports and talk openly about an issue that women are having and be able to support them. So the less typical here might just be less typical for us. We might assume most elderly women aren't comfortable with technology, for example, and we may not think about shorter men much, but it's the typical and the what isn't typical is situationally dependent, is context dependent, is scenario dependent. So what we need to fundamentally do is question assumptions and experiment with what we're doing. So if you really want to design for women, then ask yourself, who are the most marginalized women? And then ask, in this context, in this culture, in this scenario, it has to be more than just a group or a taxonomy. It's meaningless otherwise. And what I want to talk about is that we're all fundamentally different. So even sorting into these more complex buckets is limited. So we all design our living rooms differently. This is a picture of a living room. Maybe we all have couches, we all have a chair, we all have some sort of light, we all have some sort of table, but my living room doesn't look like this. And the phone screen on the right some of our phones are organized like this, but it doesn't look exactly like this. This is the way we customize our world and our life, digitally and in the built environment. So this person has a whole bunch of folders that they put all of their apps into, and the apps, I mean, it just looks like tons and tons of apps. I've also seen an iPhone home screen that has 3 apps on it only, and those are the 3 they use the most because they don't want the distractions of all the other apps. The point is, we all do these things differently. This next slide is about our human tendencies to sort and organize, that our fondness for symmetry and what I call other delicious mind delights. And it's got some pictures of things that appeal to some of us. So for instance, a really tightly organized utensil drawer. Mine you have to shake to get open. We all do these things differently. Spice cabinet organization. When my sister was a little kid, she organized our spices by color, which drove my mother nuts because she couldn't find anything. But we all organize differently. We can organize by size of the eggs in the upper left, or we can organize by hue. Some of the ones in the green bucket look like they might fit into yellow as well. People who own Tom Bin bags get really excited about showing all of the stuff they can fit into their bags online. So they lay it out in this perfect little square with the bag and then take pictures of it. And you see other little things, like people get agitated if there's a puzzle and there's one piece missing, and we like the symmetry and the beauty of nature. Fundamentally, we all want to be seen and heard, and we expect to be able to personalize our services, our devices, our spaces, our interactions, and more. So why would it be any different if this technology is coming into my life and into my space, especially for me to interact with it? So again, what I want to argue is that if we start with the extremes and look for commonalities or patterns, but still ask ourselves the questions, look for those counter examples, look where it fails for somebody, that we'll be doing more thorough and more inclusive design. This is a picture from the Microsoft Design Guide, and this is something that we worked with them on, and it shows just those commonalities. The person who is nonverbal has something in common with the person with laryngitis, and the person that has a heavy accent and isn't being understood in that particular context. So it shows that basically we need to resist the urge to generalize in people. And when we talk about disability, we talk about it from a social and environmental perspective. So we really talk about it as mismatch between the individual and what they're trying to accomplish and what's available to them. People who are in wheelchairs didn't experience barriers until people built sidewalks that didn't have curb cuts in them, and then we had to retrofit them for curb cuts. It's a different perspective than thinking, oh, we have to change the way we created this sidewalk because people who are in wheelchairs and need to be able to wheel between streets won't be able to use it. So this is just a picture of a square peg in a round hole, just to show that it's that mismatch that is really what we can solve for. And as smart people who like to solve problems, I think that we, as all of us are designers and making decisions about how to design, we have the ability to do that. So what we need to do, I contend, is change the way we think and feel and do. And how can we do some of this rethinking? And I think that it starts with letting the world be complex, sometimes chaotic and unpredictable. And it means asking the questions, who's been architecting our world? So who made the decision that men's rooms and women's rooms need to be exactly the same size and that they need to be based on gender rather than the equipment that's inside the bathroom? Who made the rules that we follow? Do they still make sense to us? What's our tolerance for exclusion? Like, how comfortable are we when the restrooms no longer meet the needs of the people who need to go and use them? And who stands to benefit from a perpetuation of things being done the way that we're doing them? I would also warn that we should be aware of taxonomies. As you probably picked up, I called it the tyranny of taxonomies. Also be aware of the binary. It's often a reason for oversimplification. I'm fond of threes: yes, no, and maybe, black, white, and gray, everything in between. So I am wary anytime I see an either or. Beware of certainty. I think that it's worrisome when we have certainty about something that we can't possibly know. And then beware also of completion. Part of rethinking is also allowing for differences. So asking ourselves, who did you exclude with your decisions? So often we think of our design decisions very, very long, thoughtful decisions that we're making. We get a lot of input, we get a lot of feedback. But instead of feeling satisfied with the decision, I think we should have a pit in our stomachs a bit and ask, who did we just exclude with this decision? If I decided option B rather than A or C through Z, who did I just exclude? And who can benefit from the design decision I made, and who will not benefit or not be able to reuse it? And then how can we re-feel? I think that part of beginning to do this refeeling is asking this question: was I brilliant, or did I just perpetuate or further contribute to a cycle of exclusion and bias? And this is knowing ourselves a bit. The story I tell is my dad was recently a judge in a car show, and he said to me, you know, it went really well, but I learned something about myself. I hate yellow cars. And I said, wow, Dad, that's really good. That's good that you know that. You know, how did you mitigate for that? How did you make sure that that didn't show up in your judging? And he said, I didn't. I hate yellow cars. So there's a difference between knowing it and then doing something about it. In that case, I asked, well, what about the other judges? Did they hate yellow cars too? And he said, well, it made me feel better about hating the yellow cars because none of the yellow cars appeared on any of their top picks either. So it gave him some sort of reassurance because of the diversity of judges. They could have had a conversation about yellow cars. The point is that he brought in those biases and he was aware of them and upfront about them. So all this to say, resist the urge to know, especially a person. It's very, very difficult to have that kind of hubris, to think that we know what somebody needs or know how to fix something for somebody. Focus on the one size fits one, empower the users, and sort of nurture this curiosity that I think we all have. And then be very wary of personas. They're meant to model behavior. They are not meant to represent full demographics of complex and unique people. And just keep in mind that reflecting on what you're doing and why is an essential part to making sure that you're answering those fundamental questions that the grandchild would ask, the whys, and that change doesn't happen overnight. A lot of what I'm talking about is fundamental changes to the way that we think and do things, and sort of realizing that that can start small and that's okay. So how do we redo some of the things that we're doing? The first thing is, I would say, don't solve right away. Instead, think about those counterexamples or for whom it would fail. Do some lateral thinking. So look at the problem from another angle or from the edges, from relaxed attention. That's sort of you have your brilliant idea when you're in the shower or when you're up walking around. And it's sort of instead of the first thing that comes to mind, let that come to mind and then think about the opposite. And then that helps you sort of check in on your own assumptions, because if you're thinking about how do I make this work beautifully for somebody, think about how to make it fail. So don't solve for the 80%, solve for the 20. And then ask, who's missing? Who isn't here and why? We often in our conversations about diversity and inclusion talk about the table, inviting people to the table. And here's a picture of a picnic table. When we talk about inviting people to the table, we need to still be quite critical about that. So is the table welcoming to all? Can everybody come to this table?
Hey, Jess, I'm just going to give you about a 4-minute warning, just sort of interrupt you, just so you time check
Okay.
for about 4
Cool.
minutes. Thank you. Your talk is awesome.
So is the table welcoming to all? Have they been at the table before? Do they know the culture of the table? Do they know how decisions are made at the table? Is the environment safe and welcoming and open? Is listening captured? Is listening and capturing what's going on at the table clear to them? How is it being captured? Do those at the table have real ways to have an impact? Are they empowered to act on what they discuss? Or is this just, sharing your intellectual labor but not doing anything with it? How is this going to be followed up? How are they invited to the table? Are we asking them to come to our table, or are we coming to their table? So it's both a metaphorical and obviously a literal table. Tables are really interesting to me because there are always power dynamics at play in tables, like who sits where. So just to switch gears now, the power of design, as John Carey, an architect who did a really brilliant TED Talk, and I would recommend you go and have a look at it. He says design has the unique ability to dignify, and it can make people feel valued, respected, honored, and seen. And this is both the opportunity and the responsibility of design. So you remember that WebAIM website that I showed you with the skip the content. Those are the subtle ways that we say, you're welcome here. This is for you. I would also recommend that we resist the urge to design for. And this is an architectural assumption that we make, that we can engineer a fix. Technology can solve it for all people. We're smart people. We know what's best. But engineers are not the only ones who are building. We all adapt and grow designs, and I call this user continued design. So, for instance, Pinterest is a whole site built on this concept. So, two images here. One is of little kids' cute rain boots that are always in bright colors and patterns being used now as planters on a fence, and the second is a Lego lamp. So you let the light sort of shine through, and you can see the casting of the shadows and such from the Legos. What we get to fundamentally is when we scratch the surface, that designing something inclusively gets at issues of equity, diversity, and inclusion. So it requires us not only to change our methodological approach, but also to examine our own biases and to know ourselves, as the other slide said. So I just want to leave you this sort of piece. Barbara Chow, formerly from the Hewlett Foundation, said this, that diversity is a number, inclusion is a process, and equity is an outcome. When I think about diversity, and all of our organizations are on this continuum of addressing diversity and inclusion, it's not something that's ever completed. It's a practice, and it's something that we all want to practice. So diversity as a number is demographics. I can see diversity. I can count it. I can put it into a questionnaire and get some basic information about you, and then talk about the diversity of maybe where you were born, or diversity of socioeconomic status, or something like that. Inclusion is different. Inclusion is a process, and it's a little bit more difficult to measure. So how much of your full self are you bringing to the design conversation? How much are the power dynamics at that table having an impact on what you're saying? And equity as the outcome is, how well did we do on our diversity and inclusion? Did we achieve a state where we have actually created an equitable situation? So the voices that are typically not heard are being heard. So success here is flexibility, responsiveness, adaptability. So as much as possible, let me choose. Give me the agency. Give me the choice. I'm the best at being me, even though it's fun to speculate about how best to be me. And then who's doing it? So whose voice is heard? Who's seen? What are we doing, and why are we doing it? Who is this for? Fundamentally, where's the capital? Who stands to benefit or gain or succeed from this? Who's missing and why? The edges. So being aware of power, where does it circulate and when? And then finally, maybe even exactly on time, find a mentor. This is a picture of two of my dogs. One smaller looking up to the bigger one. Unfortunately, the bigger one is very naughty, so the smaller one has picked up a lot of the naughtiness. But find a mentor that you can talk to, because these things are not black and white. They are gray. They require thought. They require a thoughtfulness. They require a continuous improvement. They require a kind of commitment to practicing. So I think that that's it, and that's how you can get in touch with me.
Thanks, Jess. I think I'm going to have to watch that a couple more times. There's so much in there to unpack, and so much that's relevant to the work that we're doing. And also I had some back channels of people that are equally as excited. There's some questions on the hack. I'm still not sure what to call this thing. I always feel hackpad feels weird. But anyways, there's a list of questions. I'll just ask you to, if you're able to asynchronously ask those, because I'm probably just going to switch over to Alicia in a second. But I just want to speak one question. Just one question that was mine. That was really compelling, the idea of taxonomy. I didn't realize I was doing that. I'm doing a lot of research right now to thinking about how we can help new parents or new moms be more engaged with open source. And I'm like, anyway, so that was, I felt called out in a really good way around that. And I guess my question around is like, how do you figure out what you mentioned, and I wrote it here, edge cases. Yeah, so you mentioned things like, maybe it's a new mom in this culture or this scenario. How do you identify those cultures or scenarios or attributes, I guess? Like, how do you pull those out? It's not clear to me.
No,
yet.
that is the question. So
Okay.
the answer is there's no one answer, and that's infuriating to some people who want a scientific process or 10 steps doing inclusive design and then you check it off. This is not going to be a checklist. So what you can do is you can start by saying, okay, we want to deal with moms and getting new moms involved in open source. So who are our most marginalized new moms? And it might be new dads. So for instance, we make a lot of assumptions about who new parents are. Is it important that it's new moms and it's not new parents? And it may be that the answer is yes, just like not having text on the buttons stayed. It didn't change the design, but having an awareness of who you're excluding and being quite transparent about it and quite aware, eyes wide open. If we're going to exclude you, we already thought about this and we knew we were doing this and we did this for this reason. And you have an explanation. So new moms who are the most marginalized or the most edge might be new moms who are also new immigrants, new moms who don't speak the language, new moms who don't have a degree, new moms who don't have experience in the workforce and have been out for a number of years and are just starting up now. And so they've got gaps in their resumes, for example. So asking sort of who are new moms ever more, I think is what we should be doing. And it gets us into the realm of ethics rather than into the realm of black and white answers. So we could continue to ask that, and we should, is what I contend, continue to ask who isn't being met by what we're doing now, who are we excluding implicitly, or if we're excluding somebody explicitly, then let's be explicit about it.
Yeah, that was just probably one of about 30 different things I made personal notes about. So if anyone else has questions, they can add them in the hackpad. I don't know if you have time, Jess, to see any of those. And then if people want to ask questions afterwards, Twitter looks like that's a good way to poke you, or because we do get a lot of people watching after the fact. So I was just wondering.
Yeah, sorry. I also mentioned my email address. I didn't put it on the slide, but it's J Mitchell, JMITCHELL @ocadu.ca.
Yeah, and you can get a hold of me too if you need. I can also share that with you. So thanks so much. That was really great, and I'm going to go to Alicia next. And have a great rest of your day, Jess. Thanks for answering.
Thanks for having me.
My pleasure. Alicia Gray, thank you for joining us. Thank you. I know there's a few people on this call that are specifically interested in your expertise, which is that you're the Senior Manager of Privacy and Trust at Mozilla. You're one of my colleagues that I love working with. You've got 20 years of experience in taking legal and regulatory requirements and turning them into compliance programs. And the context of all of this is people have been asking, how does GDPR apply to our code of conduct? And I advanced you a few questions, and I'll let you take it from there.
Great, thank you. Thank you for the introduction, and hello, everybody. I'll just start with a very broad overview of GDPR just to make sure everybody kind of has the right foundation for understanding, and then I'll just kind of delve into the questions that Emma provided me, and feel free to, it's HackPad where the questions are going, Emma. Feel free to throw any more questions.
Yeah, I will. Yeah, there's HackPad, or also there's the Q&A in Air Mozilla. I'll try and monitor those as well.
Okay,
so you don't
great.
have to.
And we'll try to address those as we have time. So first and foremost, just for general background, GDPR stands for the General Data Protection Regulation, which is an European Union law. It creates a single set of privacy rules for the EEA and EU country members. It went into effect on May 25th of 2018, so just a few months ago. And it's designed to give people more control over their personal data and holds organizations or groups or entities that process that data to a high standard of accountability. It's important to realize and understand that GDPR is not a brand new law. It builds on a set of existing laws that had been in effect in Europe since 1995. So although it does provide some increased rights, it is not a brand new starting point. These things, for the most part, were already in place, and this just ups the ante. A couple of things where it does up the ante is it does reinforce Europeans' rights to access, correct, delete, and object to the processing of their personal data. It also requires some organizations, and there's a lot of dependencies here, so I'm going to say maybe require you to port personal information from one service to another. So for instance, you can move your iTunes account to another music provider, and you have to be able to port that. And then there's some other limitations on automated processing and profiling, which probably doesn't apply in the context to which we're speaking today. So that just kind of sets up the background for everybody. So with that being said, let me dive into some of these questions where I think we can build from. So one of the main questions was, are code of conduct reports subject to GDPR? And if so, why is this the case? So the answer to that question is yes. If you are processing personal data, and that includes taking names or other identifiable information from somebody within the European Union, it does fall under GDPR. There are very few carve-outs for that, mostly government agencies. And if you just like kept an address book for your personal use, like your home use, then that's carved out. But nonprofits are not exempt. Open source is not exempt. So if you are processing personal data, you're going to need to decide whether GDPR applies to you or not. And it does apply to any email address, first, last name, anything that's identifiable to an individual, you are responsible for protecting under GDPR. So if code of conduct reports are subject to GDPR, how does that mean report information needs to be handled? So I'm going to start off by saying a couple of things. The information I'm going to provide you is going to be specific to your particular organization and entity and how you collect and manage your data. So you're going to need to take a look at your own practices and how you collect and the services that you use. So this is a very broad overview. Also, kind of second disclaimer, I am a compliance professional, but I am not an attorney, so this is not legal advice. This is just my experience and how I've taken these things and put them into practice. So that being said, if you're taking in a code of conduct report, the first thing you need to really think about is what system are you taking that information in? Meaning, do you have an online reporting system? Are you using a telephone system of some type? Are your reports coming in via email? So what's your avenue for accepting those reports? How do they come into you? And then once you have that report, how are you tracking and storing that information? So do you keep it in a central database of some type? Is it in a Google Doc, in a Google Sheet? Are you keeping it in Excel? Are you keeping it in Word? Do you have some kind of a SaaS platform that you're maintaining it in? So you have to think about where that data is. And you need then to think about, okay, if we're keeping it in these things, now I have these other obligations, such as how long do I need to keep this information, and the data subject rights, which we'll talk about in a minute. Is somebody allowed to have access to this information? Can they require me to delete it? So how your information comes in and where you store it will have a great deal of impact on how you manage your program and how you manage your GDPR compliance. It's like any program, the more scattered it is, the more difficult it is to kind of manage it and show that you have a good foundation and a good setup for your data management program. So I'm going to add on to that, and then I'm going to backtrack just a little bit. So if you're using vendors, which a lot of us do, another question that often arises, and I saw in this list from Emma, was if we're using a GDPR compliant service like Google or like a GitHub or some other type of service that's already GDPR compliant, does that make me GDPR compliant? And so the answer to that is actually no. You should have GDPR compliant service providers. However, just because Google is compliant or GitHub is compliant does not mean that your practice is actually compliant. So you, in this case, are considered what they call a data controller. So you receive the information in, somebody's giving it to you. That makes you the owner of the data. You've collected it. When you pass it to a Google or a GitHub or a Conversant or some other type of system, they're processing it for you, meaning that they're helping you, they're providing a service, but you are actually responsible for that data set. And so they may offer something that's compliant, but if you don't have policies and procedures and you're not providing data subject access rights or doing other things that you're required to do, then you're not compliant with GDPR. So be very careful there. You need to make sure that your house is in order, and part of that house is your sub-processor, your vendor, but that's not your entire compliance program. So that being said, then we'll backtrack a little bit about now you have this data set. You own it, you're responsible for it. So some of the things that GDPR will require of you, and part of this is just good data management, is that you're only collecting that information which you absolutely need to collect. So if somebody provides you a conduct report and they're making a complaint about so-and-so, and they want to tell you that that person has this color eyes and they drive this kind of car and maybe this is their phone number, some of that information you simply don't need, and you should decline to receive it. You only need to get the information that you absolutely need for the report. So data minimization is really important. Too much information is sometimes just too much information, and you would want to stay away from that. The second piece of this is, now how do you protect this information? You've received it. Obviously, it's a report of a sensitive nature, more than likely. So you are also obligated under GDPR to protect this information. And what that means is, do you have it in a system that's locked down? Do you provide role-based access controls into that data so that only certain people can see certain things? Not everybody needs to see everything. This is particularly important if you're using collaborative sharing tools such as Google Docs, because it's very easy for those links to get released very easily if you're not very good about your sharing management. So be very cautious about that. Another thing you want to think about there as well is the retention piece. And so this gets a little bit into the data subject rights, so I'm kind of saving for the end because they're kind of complicated. But how long are you going to keep this information around? So maybe you have a complaint that is about imminent harm, threats to a business, a group, a person. That kind of information you have a legitimate right to keep, and you may very well have a legal basis for keeping under GDPR. But if it's just a complaint about this person at this venue said something I didn't like, you address it with the person that made the comment and it never happens again. Maybe in 3 years you don't need to keep that information. So it's a good idea to set up a matrix of things that you need to keep, things that you want to keep, and then things that you don't need to keep for very long, so that you can decide how you want to best manage this. There are a number of carve-outs in GDPR for why you can keep certain pieces of information, and those are called legal basis. And so what you want to be able to do is say, we've kept this information under this legal basis for this particular reason, so that if you're ever questioned about why you still have it, you have a legitimate reason for keeping that information. I know we're kind of short on time because I understand meeting got started a little bit late, so I want to jump to the data subject access rights. A couple of the main questions that always come up, and I see them in the list from Emma as well, is the data subjects, and that just means a person, the right to ask to delete their information. So to address that, the right to delete is not an absolute right. That doesn't mean just because you have somebody's information that they have the right to ask. They can ask you to get rid of it. Doesn't mean you have to get rid of it. Excuse me. So for instance, if there's a legitimate reason to keep it, so-and-so has made a viable physical harm threat against a person, you may very well have a legal obligation to report that to law enforcement. You would probably have a very legitimate reason for keeping that for the security and safety of your groups and your spaces. So in those cases, you can decline to delete information. And in some cases, you may have to turn it over. So there could be other reasons why you cannot delete it. So I just want to be really clear, deletion is not an absolute right. Also, access to information is not an absolute right. So if somebody was to contact you and say, I want to know if anybody filed a report about me, that is also not an absolute right. There are carve-outs as to why that information may not be readily available to them, particularly, and again, this is a very solid kind of example, but if there's a threat of imminent harm, so if somebody has reported that so-and-so has made a threat against them, telling that person that we've received a report about that may not be in the best interest of the reporter. So there are definitely a lot of gray areas in here, which is really important to know. So you are going to have to dive into GDPR to figure out when do you need to provide information and when do you not need to provide information. Excuse me. So that's really important. A couple of other things, and I think, Emma, we're going to be running up on time here, so please let me know.
Yeah, thank you for going over. I appreciate it.
Yeah, sure, not a problem. I'm free, so I just don't know what other people's time looks like.
Okay, yeah, if you're able to finish the questions in your time, then that would be great for the rest of us, I think. Thank you.
Sure, absolutely. So there's also this idea within GDPR about kind of pseudonymizing or de-identifying people's name and keeping that in a report. And you can absolutely do that. So for instance, a lot of organizations are interested in keeping track of over a period of time. We had X amount of harassment complaints. We had X amount of this type of complaint and that type of complaint. And if you haven't had to take action against an individual, or if you did take action and the person has responded appropriately and seems to no longer be an issue, but you want to keep some metrics and statistics, you can absolutely do that by stripping the identifying information out of that report. And then you are absolutely allowed to keep it as long as you've stripped it. And it is truly stripped. So that doesn't mean that you get to keep a spreadsheet over here with all the identifying information and then a spreadsheet over here without the identifying information and call that anonymized, because that's not. You could still combine the two spreadsheets back together. So if you're going to say that you've de-identified it or anonymized it, it needs to be truly anonymized and de-identified. Let's see, a couple other questions in here. As a small organization without capacity to develop specific tools, what reporting options might there be? So a lot of companies do this just very organically and will use a Google Sheet or a Google Doc or an Excel spreadsheet or just some kind of online tool, and they will just take phone calls and emails and they will track it in those documents. The programs don't need to be onerous and they don't need to be super process heavy. What you do have to be able to do is to access that information and manage it in a timely manner. So you need to just set up a tool or some kind of system that works for your particular organization. And like I said, it does not need to be over the top and super expensive or super heavy. You just need to have somebody that's willing to take the time and make the effort to keep the information up to date and keep it managed properly. Jess said something, I was listening in at the end, and she said, the D&I practice is never complete, it's always a practice. And that same rule of thought applies here to compliance. Compliance is a practice. Your process is never complete. It's never 100%. It will be ongoing because there'll always be some other regulation that comes out that you'll need to implement. So it's kind of a good idea to keep here. You're going to grow it over time, and it will move along with your particular needs of your organization and as you grow, how you take in your reports. Let's see, another question. What about physical description to identify a person who violated a code of conduct at an event? I think that's okay if the report has come in, and I'm going to guess here a little bit about what the question's trying to get at, but I think if the report is, I was bothered by, somebody who was about 6'2", I don't know, blonde hair, brown-eyed, female in this part of this particular venue. Yeah, you can accept that information. There is a fine balance between collecting enough information to do the investigation, which you need to do for the purposes of safety and security and people feeling comfortable that they're being heard, versus taking in so much information that you have way more than you need. So if the physical description is helpful to try to narrow down who that person is, then that's fine. If the fact that this person also drove a red Beetle and left the building, then that's fine too, if that helps you with that information. But it's not necessary to know necessarily that that person has a yellow Labrador Retriever. That would be extraneous. So you have to make some judgment calls about what information is really necessary for you to do your work in terms of code of conduct investigations. And so a lot of this is very gray. It's very situationally specific. And if you're ever not sure, then you should take the information that you need to conduct your investigation. If you find out that it's extraneous after the fact, then get rid of it. There's no reason to keep it past that point. Emma, we're at about 10:08.
Yeah, I think that we got through most of those. Did anyone, I mean, we're over, so, but did anyone have any like questions that weren't answered there before I let Alicia go? It's a little bit late.
There's a question here about a ban maybe we could address really quickly
Sure.
if we have a couple of minutes. So
Yeah,
if a report involves a ban and the ban is not publicized, what happens if a person asks for personally identifiable information to remove from code of conduct records? Not sure if a ban can be enforced by registration staff if they can't have the name and picture of a banned person. So I think what this question is going to is this notion of when do we have a legitimate interest to keep it, and when do we not have a legitimate interest to maintain that information anymore? So I think this goes back to the notion of if somebody's behavior has been so poor that they are banned from a venue and can no longer participate, then that information should be maintained. We absolutely have you would absolutely have a reason for keeping that, and that could be well justified that this person was a threat or whatever the reason was, and that information you can certainly maintain. You would just need to make it really clear in your policies and procedures. And I think I just want to make one final point on that. All of these processes around accepting reports, who has access to them, what systems you keep them in, how long you keep this information for, GDPR does require you to keep documentation on policies and procedures. So whatever you do, you want to document it and make sure that that's really laid out so people know what to expect, how to handle the data, and who's responsible for that data. And I think we have one final question. Let's see. Special category of data question. Special categories of data have a separate list of allowable reasons for processing, and I'm not sure, short of blanket consent from everybody, which is a barrier to participation and can probably be withdrawn, that operating a code of conduct fits with any of them. Okay, so this question is referring to, under GDPR, there are special categories of data which entities, groups, organizations can't just process. So for instance, religious affiliation, sexual orientation, things of that nature, you can't just process because of Europe's history, World War II history with use of sensitive information. So if this information comes up as the result of a report, and it is important to the report, you can process it. You don't need special permission to do that. This may be very relevant to the report that you've received, especially if somebody is saying that they were harassed as a result of a special category of data. What GDPR is trying to get to is that people can't just collect this information for the sheer fact of collecting it. So for instance, if you want demographic information and you want race and ethnicity and religion and sexual orientation, then GDPR requires you to have a higher bar for collection and protection. And if you can't protect that data in a relevant manner, you may very well have to go and get supervisory authority to process that data. So I would say in a code of conduct situation, if it's provided to you as part of the report, that's fine. You shouldn't ask for it directly.
Great. Thank you so much. I think that you covered a lot, and
It was very quick.
Yeah, that was great. And I like that you aligned it with what Jess was saying about you're never really done, and so that was a cool cool bit. Thank you everyone for joining the call. Please share this call with your networks and social media. We're trying to build this community around best practices for diversity and inclusion. Alicia, thank you so much again for the call. Jess, as well, I have to go watch that call again now, and we'll see you on the internets. Until next time. Bye-bye.